That was the first time I felt this inner self stand up for me in a way that I had been so repressed that I was just always following the rules, and this was like, something's wrong. Maybe my dad doesn't actually want the best for me, or maybe what he's saying is not true. And so I held that really close for years. I didn't know how to leave, but I knew that if I ever fell in love, I would never let my dad ruin my relationship again.
That is so fucked up. It's fucked up. So fucked up. It is just so damn fucked up. That's fucked up.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This will be kind of a different podcast for TSFU. Not only will we get to talk to an amazing author about her new book, but also it's just going to be me, Fallon Morey, for today. I'll be your one host, along with Cait West, who's in the studio. So we're here to talk about her new memoir, Rift, which is a memoir of breaking away from the Christian patriarchy. I, again, am your host, Fallon Morey. This is That's So Fucked Up, a true crime comedy podcast about cults, crimes, and other things that make you say, ugh, that's so fucked up. Ash definitely does that tagline a little more justice than I do, but I think we're going to start rolling. I'm going to jump right in, and I want to say welcome, Cait. It's so good that we finally get to talk to you on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So before we kick off with just jumping in, is there anything you want to say to lead us in? Anything you want to kind of open us up with?
Sure, I guess I could just introduce myself. I'm a writer and an editor. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and my new book is coming out soon, if not already, when this podcast drops. So that's exciting. It's my first book. And it's about my growing up in the Christian patriarchy movement. So a very specific kind of Christian patriarchy, and it's pretty fucked up. So that's what I'm here to talk about.
That's a perfect segue in. We did a little bit in an earlier series this past year where we talked about specifically the series on the Duggars, 19 Kids and Counting, and that spurred a lot of different discussion for us about fundamentalism versus evangelicalism or evangelism. I could have the words wrong. But I was wondering if you'd kind of give us a quick rundown for our listeners about what you mean or what is meant by when we hear the term Christian patriarchy, just so we're all on the same page.
Sure. I mean, in general, it's the Christian version of patriarchy, which is this hierarchy where men are at the top and the ones who benefit from the way society is run. And so I think that patriarchy is all over our American culture, but also in our churches. What I'm talking about, though, is a specific movement that called itself Christian patriarchy, and sometimes it called itself biblical patriarchy. And that's the kind of thing that the Duggars follow, people like Doug Wilson, other patriarchal leaders. It's promoting a very literal interpretation of the Old Testament and how society should be run. It's taking it to the extreme, basically. So men are in charge of the family, the church, they should be in charge of the government, and women are supposed to submit to that. So for a girl like me growing up, I was told that I would never go to college or go on dates, that I would never have a job, and that my job would be to get married and have as many children as possible. So me being a daughter in this movement, I grew up being told that I would never go on dates or have a choice in my relationships or go to college or have a job. And my one calling was to be a wife and mother to as many kids as God gave me. And I would be a homeschool mom. So I didn't know any other possibility for my life. And that's why I was called a stay-at-home daughter. Some people used that term, and it's not in fashion anymore, but it still exists.
Since you mentioned stay-at-home daughter, when I first heard the term, I really wasn't familiar with it. And I think that a lot of even people who consider themselves to be Christians or Christian women would find this kind of concept pretty shocking. My family is not like evangelical Christian, they're Christian Catholic. And I know that my mom was like, please get out of my house as soon as possible and do your own life. So why do you think that stories like this really are important to get out?
I mean, I think that patriarchy happens on a spectrum. So even when I left, I saw patriarchal structures in churches that I thought were safer. They were just more subtle. And so I was able to see the warning signs, and I witnessed the church become more and more indoctrinated in these extreme ideas because they're not noticing how they already are following patriarchy. And so I know that my story is extreme, but I think it's just the leaders just took the same principles to heart and really took everything very literally to the point of control of women. You know, in the broader evangelical church, I can't speak to Catholicism because that's not my experience, but in evangelicalism, women are still made to feel like they're less than men. In most churches, women aren't allowed to lead men or have any real decision-making power in that structure. So it still exists. It's just a different flavor.
Yeah, that's so interesting too, considering that, you know, they, especially to me, it's always been interesting because they trust women to homeschool their children. Like that is your goal. And those are the children that, including the boys, that they intend to raise into those positions that will take over the church eventually. So then to turn around and be like, well, you're good for giving them the foundation, but we don't actually trust you to lead anyone. Like, do they not consider the homeschooling and the work done as leadership?
It's a good point. I mean, homeschooling, for one thing, in my experience, wasn't a very rigorous education. So it wasn't like women were teaching a lot of things. It was more of, here's some books to read and go teach yourself. And then also in a lot of families, the boys would be mentored by men in the church. And so as they became older teenagers and young men, they wouldn't be taught by women anymore. They'd be given apprenticeships or internships with other people in the church. And so there was definitely a difference between how the boys and the girls were treated, even as homeschooled.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a good point. So you said that homeschooling wasn't particularly rigorous, and you were told basically like you'll never get a job. And I know reading the end of your story about how you ended up moving to Michigan and you were sort of on your own without any kind of formal training or without training to do really anything outside of really the home, I guess. How did you end up learning to do all that? You know, finding a job and eventually going to college. And what was that like for you?
It was really hard.
Wild understatement.
I'm trying to figure out where to start. I had gotten engaged also at the same time that I was leaving my parents' house. So that's part of the story, is having this forbidden relationship.
Yeah.
But I moved in with his grandparents. So they gave me a home for a few months while we tried to find an apartment. And after that, I walked to the library because I didn't have a car and look up how to write a resume or like look up job applications and try to find something that I could do. I eventually reverted back to teaching piano lessons, which is partially how I got out, is saving money through teaching piano to homeschoolers. So that was a fallback I had. And then I got a job at a bakery, but I'm kind of shocked to this day that I got any job. I had so many interviews and so many applications before I finally got something. And then I got into community college.
Wow. Through
researching how to do that through grants and scholarships. So it was a struggle, but I already had taught myself so much through homeschooling, because it was basically me teaching myself, that I took those skills with me and had to figure out what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and you were kind of running like your own mini business, I guess, by doing your piano lessons and scheduling kids. So I'm sure that at least you had that little bit in your back pocket. I was hoping to go back more to the beginning of your story. There is this one section where as soon as I read it, it was really interesting to me about just how quickly things can change. And you describe in your book that you one year had worn this two-piece swimsuit as a child and it was acceptable. And by the next year, you were told you couldn't wear that anymore. And what effect did that have on you? What did that tell you about yourself, or what did you take away from that being so young?
Yeah, and the story you're talking about was when I was 5 years old. And, you know, you don't have a lot of language for all your feelings at that age. So now looking back, I'm trying to understand what I feel. But what I remember is one year I had this bathing suit. The next year I put it on. I wanted to go swimming in the lake because we were on vacation. And my dad told my mother to tell me to go change, which is this interesting dynamic of the hierarchy in this patriarchal family.
Interesting. Like a workplace, like the boss tells the manager who tells the employee. Wow.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm this little girl and I don't know the difference between a one-piece and a two-piece bathing suit. You know, all I remember is feeling shame, like I did something wrong because I was in trouble. That just because I put this bathing suit on, that something was wrong with my body because it was showing more of it. And so now I can look back and say, oh, I was being sexualized as a child. I was being shamed for the way my body is just because I'm a female.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking now. But that's one of my earliest memories of being body shamed.
Wow.
And I carried that throughout my childhood.
Oh my gosh. You're right. When you're 5, I have little kids, and I know when they were 4 and 5, they have no concept of shame. And when they do, it's always adult imparted. It's always the adult that says that behavior, that thing about you is wrong because I recognize it as wrong, which, obviously what you said, something that was really striking to me in reading some of your examples was that things seem to change so quickly. And I didn't know if it was like that from your perspective, but from the way things in your family were to the way they became. I was just curious, was this because of some of those conferences your father attended, or really was there a certain turning point where it just sort of all seemed to flip for you guys?
That's a good question. And I can only speculate based on what I observed.
Yeah.
So I can trace the steps from how we got from there to me living at home as a 25-year-old, right? And so I believe my father is drawn to a more authoritarian type of family, or leading his family. And
right.
I think he was drawn to teachings that validated his control of us. And so he would listen to the radio, Rush Limbaugh was one of his favorites. But also James Dobson was in there, Doug Wilson, I mentioned him earlier.
Mm-hmm.
These people had radio programs and cassettes because this was the 90s. And he listened to that all the time. And then he went to a conference in Moscow, Idaho once. And another part I talk in the book about this one family, from what I remember, they're the ones who introduced us to Patriarch magazine and this whole movement to actually name what was happening as patriarchy, as a good thing. And so we would get this magazine in the mail, and it would teach the men how to be controllers of the home and how women should submit to that and how to control your children's courtships. And I ordered some so that I know it's real. It's really distressing to read now because it's validating control and abuse under the guise of protection. So, for me, it felt like a gradual change, but every step felt like it made sense based on the previous step.
Where you sort of you're snowballing into a thing, but because it's accumulating little by little, you're just not, you're not aware. And then suddenly you're like, how did that all happen?
Right. I went to a Christian school for a few months in kindergarten, and then my parents pulled me out to start homeschooling. So,
and I have marked that in the book, and I was I marked that, and I said, what was behind that decision in my little note? Because it seemed like all of a sudden it was okay, now we're not doing this anymore.
Right. Yeah, and I didn't understand at the time, but then later my parents told me this is to protect you, this is to keep you away from teachings of evolution and being, able to have sex, stuff like that. I didn't understand that as a 5-year-old, but I didn't understand my parents thought this would be more godly, right? And so they got that message from somewhere, I imagine from, this homeschooling movement in the 90s that was happening.
Right, and it's always interesting to me when I hear people who have been victims or part of these movements say, my parents pulled me from a Christian school because it was way too dangerous to my Christian views. Oh my gosh, public school's just the Wild West. We're all, we're all in hell over there. Just everyone walks into school with no clothes on. I don't know. It's just very interesting, when Christian views become too radical.
Yeah, it's really funny now to look back and be like, oh, probably was a pretty conservative school.
Yeah. So they were calling the patriarchy movement what it was. This isn't just a concept. They were putting this name on it.
Yeah. And, pulling me out of school kind of speaks to that. It's this idea of controlling your children and your wife as the patriarch. They don't use the word control.
Right.
Well, they might have, but they more used it for to protect or to lead. And so there was this idea that we would live this lifestyle and hopefully, the country would fall in line eventually because that was God's teaching.
We always hear about these types of religious movements like Christian patriarchy, or when we've talked about fundamentalism, in the guise of the cult construct, just because it's control of your access to everything. It seems like your information was extremely controlled. Your exposure is controlled. You're told what to wear. And it almost seems like every house is like sort of a little mini microcosm of its own cult.
Yes.
I agree with you. It just seems like a way to set your family up to be under this control sort of, I don't want to say umbrella because that's used in another area, but
It's very similar.
I don't know, control rain cloud, I got whatever. I don't know the right term for it. So obviously a huge part of this that you mentioned and that is talked about in your book is there's this section that I found really heartbreaking. You described how you and your sister were sat down one day and your sister was like months away from being able to date. And your dad was like, just kidding. Not in these words, but just kidding. Like, that's not how we're doing it anymore. And that's this concept of, I think it's basically like your father leads the courtship process. We might have some people that don't really understand this concept. So you were expected to go through this process of courtship, as was your sister, and I'm imagining the other people you might have known. Can you share more about what that looks like for those who don't know and kind of what's involved in that?
Yeah, so courtship is this idea that you shouldn't have any kind of romantic relationships unless it's leading to marriage. And so they framed it in this way that dating is practice for divorce. And I think other people in purity culture might have heard that phrase.
Like, I got smacked with purity culture a little bit. And I definitely heard that. I'm not laughing because it's not funny, but it's like, it's ironically funny.
Yeah.
Yes, dating is practice for divorce, y'all.
Right.
If you didn't know, you're all in a downward slope.
Which doesn't make sense. You have one romantic relationship and then you're ruined for the rest of your life, basically. So like I kiss dating goodbye, but purity culture teaches sexual purity. We really took that very seriously, along with this idea of emotional purity. So we couldn't have feelings for somebody unless we were betrothed to be married. So even in the courtship process, it's very detached. And the way it works, it depends on who your father is and what style of courtship he wants to do. And my father would have weekly meetings with, well, me and my sister both went through the courtship process. So for me and the suitor, my father would sit down once a week and ask us questions from the guidebook that we had called The Pathway to Christian Marriage. I don't know if that sounds culty enough.
That sounds fun. No.
Yeah. The fun pathway, no. And then he would ask us questions and we would have conversations. And then the rest of the time, if we ever got to see each other, it would be chaperoned. So the idea was we wouldn't become attached to each other in case my father ended it, which in my case he did, and that we would be pure until we were giving ourselves away to the only one.
And I want to make sure I have this right, not to put words in your mouth, but from my understanding of purity culture, some people interpret purity culture as don't have sex before marriage. That's very often what you hear with the, I got a purity ring, like I'm promising my dad something about my sex life, which to me in general is an ew. It's a no from me.
Yep.
But like in your case, when you talk about staying pure, you're talking about, I'm guessing, no physical contact, no overly emotional involvement.
Yeah.
Basically neutral and detached until you're about to be ready to walk down the aisle.
Yeah. And again, it depends on the family, but my family was no holding hands until you're married.
Wow.
So no physical contact, and then no romantic gifts or anything like that until you were engaged. So you couldn't have anything romantic at all unless you were already promised to get married. And then in my family, you would sign a betrothal contract saying that you would get married. So that if you broke up, it would be like a divorce.
Wow. And I remember part of what I was reading was your dad stopped you on several occasions, I believe, and said, I think you have feelings for the person you're courting. And to anyone else in the world, I think we'd be like, well, hopefully.
Right.
It was a no.
Yeah.
No having feelings.
And I was like, am I just smiling too much? Am I like just enjoying life too much? Because like, how else am I supposed to interact with somebody that I might get married to? You know, it was really frustrating for me to like be that repressed. And that's when it really hit me how repressed I was.
During that process?
Yeah.
That's interesting because I imagine you'd start to sort of police everything that you're doing. I feel so sad. None of you can see Kate, but she has a beautiful smile. And I can't imagine looking at my child or somebody I know and going like, that means you're doing something bad. Did that sort of trickle into the rest of your life at the time? Like really second guessing just everything because you were being so monitored, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this constant overthinking. And I think that's why I developed OCD and this aspect of OCD, which is scrupulosity, which you're worried about every single thing you do. And there's this joke with, I mean, it's kind of fun to laugh about now, but there's a joke with people like me of when you get into a car with people who aren't in your family and you have to like think about who you're going to sit next to so that you don't touch. You're just like paranoid all the time of like all these tempting situations because heaven forbid you like rub shoulders with somebody of the opposite sex. And I can laugh about it, but also it makes me sad because I didn't experience adolescence really at all. You know, it was just constantly monitoring myself as if I was like a robot.
Wow. Yeah, I can't imagine. I'm not surprised though that you I'm sorry to hear that you developed OCD. I'm not surprised that you ended up writing a book and going to college because I imagine the amount of discipline you had to teach yourself was pretty intense.
Yeah, especially then you're like praised for that, you know, and it's like,
wow, what a cycle.
Yeah, you're unhealthy and you're anxious and then you're told that's how God wants you to be.
God wants you to be anxious and miserable.
Yeah, it fucks with your head.
Yeah, I don't want that, God, if that's like the idea of, you know, the love of God is just anxiety all the time.
Yeah.
Interesting because you said your courtship all depended on your father. During the book, I think your dad became known as this like recognized courtship expert.
Yep.
Which is just a mind-blowing type of expertise to have. To me, it sounds sort of like how to control your daughter, but what is the kind of advice he gave? What does that lecture look like? What is the top 10 checklist? It doesn't have to be 10, but like, what's your dad giving other people?
Yeah, I mean, his expertise was based on him marrying off my sister and then this other girl in our church who was single and her dad had died. So he took over like her headship and sent letters to every church in our presbytery to see if there were any single men interested. And so he got her married off that way. And so that was his expertise. But what he would do is he would take the pathway to Christian marriage and he would talk about all the steps that you would go to. And there's all these catchy phrases like you have to be prepared, you have to be purposeful, you have to be present, or I don't even know. It was like all these P words. And then the 4 stages of a relationship, which is friendship, courtship, betrothal, and then marriage. And he would talk through like how to keep your girls safe. Because most of the families in our church had only girls, which is funny to me now. We had a shortage of boys, and so we would pray for that on Sundays.
Can we get another family with some boys?
Yes, thank God, please send us some boys to marry off the girl.
And those poor boys, they have no idea what they're walking into. Just like a church full of marriageable girls that are
just felt like we were like a catalog, like come and check out, you know, the available young women.
Yeah.
So he would just, you know, talk about like, don't be tempted to let them go off by themselves. Like always make sure there's a chaperone. You have to be the parent. This is your God-given duty. Like all that kind of language you learn in church, but just framed towards controlling your kids' relationships.
Wow, it's a lot to take in. To kind of pivot, maybe this is a little happier subject, which is, I believe, if I read everything correctly, that you originally met your now husband through starting a courtship process.
Mm-hmm.
Are you comfortable talking about how you met David and how that sort of went? And then also how you kind of just decided like, that's it, I'm breaking ties, like I'm done here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll back up for a minute because my first courtship, which was the long one, that my father ended, and I get into that a little bit in the book. It's hard for me to pinpoint a reason because my dad makes arbitrary choices sometimes that I can't explain. That's just the way our family is. And when that courtship ended, I was so heartbroken because I thought I was going to get married to this person and I really cared about him. And then my father was telling me I had to repent and pray to God to forgive me for feeling that way.
Which is just bananas, by the way. I want God, who gave me the ability to feel, I'm going to ask him for an apology for feeling.
Right.
Wow.
I mean, to me, that was normal. That was typical what I would hear at home. And when he said that, you know, he's also saying you deserve to go to hell for that feeling, right? Because we were taught this Calvinist idea of total depravity. So one sin means you deserve hell.
Just to clarify for anyone listening, that means you don't get the benefit of Jesus died, so your sins are forgiven if you you're allowed to be fallible. Like, you're essentially not fallible unless you beg for forgiveness.
Well, I mean, we still were taught the idea that Jesus would have to choose us to save us, and we'd have to ask his forgiveness. But we were always told how sinful we were.
Yeah.
And just one sin meant we deserved hell. So we were told that over and over again. So even if we are forgiven, it's like, well, I deserved to, go to hell forever.
Oh my gosh. And to me, that's a big jump from like catching a few feelings to hell. Like that's a wide gulf to jump straight into.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you have to understand, like, the Calvinist perspective is that all sin is like the same punishment. There's no like difference between kinds of sins.
Right.
So that's just the background I grew up with. But when he said that, something inside of me was like, that is not true. That is a lie. And that was the first time I felt this inner self like stand up for me in a way that I had been so repressed that I was just always following the rules. And this was like, something's wrong. Maybe my dad doesn't actually want the best for me, or maybe what he's saying is not true. And so I held that really close for years. I didn't know how to leave, but I knew that if I ever fell in love, I would never let my dad ruin my relationship again.
Wow. Was that like jarring for you to sort of feel your own thoughts without repressing them? Was that like a, wow, what am I feeling right now sort of moment?
It felt like this fire. It was just like, I couldn't let it out yet. It's just knowing this is never going to happen again. I'm never going to let that happen to me.
And if we were in a movie, this is when the victory song plays quietly in the background till she finally...
Right. Except it's a slow burn, right? Because it's like several years.
Yeah, this is just the instrumental part. And then later it'll be like Rihanna, this girl's on fire, like bursting out in the background.
I wish. Yeah. So a few years later, I did fall in love with somebody at our church, and he grew up in a Christian home. He was a pastor's kid, but he didn't grow up in that movement that I had, that Christian patriarchy movement. His family would use the term complementarianism, which in my point of view is still patriarchal, but he doesn't have this idea about women not allowed to go to college or get a job. So he was confused when he met me, like, why are you living at home? Like,
yeah.
Why don't you have a job? And we became really good friends, and I opened up more and more to him, and he wanted to have a relationship with me, but he knew my dad's rules. So he asked my dad for a courtship. My dad said yes. And then a week later, he changed his mind, arbitrary reasons.
That's it. Wow.
And I was like, I remember that thought a few years ago. That's never going to happen to me. So I just continued having the relationship without really telling him about it. And that was the catalyst for me really standing up for myself. It triggered my dad to be more and more verbally abusive as I was disobeying more and more. I mean, I'm in my 20s at this point. It's not like I'm a child.
Right. But you have somebody treating you like you've never aged since you were 12. Like, the rules shouldn't change because you're in your 20s.
Right. And so I'm like having to deconstruct that idea. Like, wait, I'm not a child, actually.
No.
Like, other people my age aren't children. So how am I a child? So like, when you grow up in this kind of cult environment, you don't know better. So yeah, we continued a relationship and eventually got engaged, asked for my dad's blessing. He said no, and we moved away. And that's like very short version.
Yeah.
Because I was like mentally processing how to leave and how to make decisions for myself. And David was there as the support person, and he saw everything I was going through. And so that's always been really meaningful to me, that he knows where I came from, and he never wanted me to be treated like that. And so just being loved that way was mind-blowing.
Yeah, was being in that relationship in particular a big part of that catalyst for finally being able to be like, that's it.
Yeah.
And I'm not crazy. I literally have someone in my corner that's telling me like, no, you should not be treated like a child. You're 25.
Yeah. And his care for me, and like he would ask me questions, like things that normal people treat each other like, but I had not been used to. And the day he told me he loved me, like I cried forever, because I had never felt that kind of unconditional love from somebody.
You're going to make me cry. I'm not even a crier, but here I am. Oh.
So yeah, and now jumping forward, we've been married 11 years now, and we still have all these stories of how we got together.
Oh, I love that so much. one thing that was really striking to me was when you called your sister and you were excited about your decision and her response to that. Was she truly such a believer in the movement? Do you think that she did that, or was it coming from a different place?
Right. So at that point, I just got engaged. I called my sister to tell her, and she had been married at least 10 years at that point. She has 5 children now. I'm not sure if they were all born at that point, but I think maybe they were. And so she'd gone through the courtship process. She had followed all the rules and was also struggling in her marriage, which I knew. And so I called her to tell her, and her reaction was a lot of anger. And I was surprised because I was really happy.
Yeah.
But also, she was saying things like, how could you disappoint Dad? Like, how could you go against the process like you're supposed to do? You're dishonoring Dad. It was all focused on me being disrespectful. And I was just shocked. I didn't understand it. It created a little bit of distance between us for a little while. And, years later, we've rebuilt our relationship.
That's good.
I understand now more of why she was saying those things. She was going through a lot of terrible things in her marriage and eventually got divorced and got full custody of her children. So, she was going through a lot. So in courtship, the idea is if you follow the rules, you're going to be rewarded with this beautiful, happy marriage for the rest of your life.
Which from every story we hear across the spectrum, I think of like controlling religious situations or religious abuse or, patriarchy here or, fundamentalist groups that we've covered is like a perfect marriage. And we know that that is not what happens in a lot of cases.
No, I know so many people who went through this process and ended up in abusive marriages. And I know a lot of women who got out, which I'm really proud of them. Yeah, so that's my sister's case. That's what she was going through at that time. And I think she was just angry for a lot of reasons. And then it was directed at me. I don't think she was actually angry with me.
Right. It was just that moment of like, wow, this is a thing I didn't get to do.
Yeah.
I followed this rule and it's not the way it's supposed to do. Like what,
right. Yeah. And it's just like, it's hard to grapple with that. Sometimes I feel survivor guilt.
Interesting.
A little bit of how come I got to have a happy marriage? I've witnessed so many people have really bad experiences after courtship. And I feel really lucky in that way. At the same time, I did go through a courtship earlier and I did go through a lot of difficult things.
Right.
But I was able to get out and not get stuck in a bad marriage.
Yeah. I hope that you can not have that kind of survivor guilt because you did get to make your own choice and you decided to make your own choice, which is incredibly appreciable considering you had to leave with no training and fly across an ocean. Guys, from Hawaii to Michigan is not just like I can drive past my parents' house. You're across an entire ocean. That's huge. And I'm sure that contributes to the fact that you got to have that ending.
Yeah.
It was interesting to me because the way you described your sister in the earlier parts of the book was that she was sort of like maybe a little bit of a rebel at times. You would listen to her CD or whatever, different things. That was surprising to me when I read that part of your story. And I was curious how that switch sort of happened.
Yeah, she was the one who had hidden VHS tapes of Titanic, the movie, in her closet and CDs that she wasn't supposed to have. When I think about her when she was a teenager, she was very vibrant and had a lot of personality. She still has a lot of personality.
Yeah.
But there was a time when, and I write about this in the book, where she almost eloped with somebody and then she came back instead of marrying him. And there was all this shame and punishment and she had to conform and she got a lot quieter after that. And that's when she had the courtship and got married. So I see that as really a pivotal time for her, this shift of going from potential freedom to going back to prison, basically.
I think that's why it's so important to see books like yours and hear just people's voices like yours saying the things that, other people have gone through in some measure and saying you can have this voice too. I think your book will be just so incredibly inspiring for so many people. I know when I was reading this, my heart was hurting, feeling the things you were writing. I'm sure that parts of this had to be really painful for you to go through writing it. And you said you've processed it now, but sort of what was behind your decision that like, okay, now I need to get this out and I want to do it in a way where I share it with so many people? Like, what was the driver for that?
Yeah, I mean, when I left, I didn't think I would ever talk about it ever again. I thought, like, I'm moved on. I'm just going to pretend it never happened. And that's just not how trauma works.
No. But when you've been taught shame your whole life, like box everything up and don't tell anybody anything because you're not supposed to, I'm sure that's a natural response.
Yeah. I think it's, self-protective a little bit.
Sure.
But as I started to heal and I went to college to study writing, I found that I kept writing bits of my story and I just couldn't help it. It just kind of came out. And then I would have these reactions from my classmates and my professors, like, what are you talking about? Like, they had never heard of these things. And I was like, well, this is just normal for me. Like, it was this weird culture shock of figuring out what's normal and what's not normal. And I don't even believe normal is a thing, actually. I think we all have kind of unique experiences. But, I started writing for class, and then I felt like this liberation, this empowerment in writing it down and telling other people about it. And then around the same time, I started talking online and realized there's a lot more people like me. And they would send me private messages to say, like, they experience that too, but they're not safe to talk about it.
Wow.
And so I still get messages like that to this day.
Ooh.
People who are still stay-at-home daughters or living in a town where they can't talk about their upbringing. So that inspired me to keep writing about it and keep talking about it. And it's just like this evolving thing and project. It just became more and more of a book. I thought I would just tell one story, and then it just became more and more stories. And I was like, I think I just need to write it as a book and get it out of my system so I can write some other things too,
Right.
And so now I feel like I've done that, and I'm hoping the book can go do its own thing. The way books do, meet the reader wherever they need it.
Yeah.
And hopefully I can create some new things too.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that expression. The book can do its own thing. Like, it's this living entity.
Okay.
Your writing style is so beautiful. I love how your imagery is from just the very first page. I was really drawn in because sometimes memoirs and autobiographies can be kind of a drag and they're very factual. It's like a chronology, and your writing is so just descriptive and evocative. And I was wondering about, between the chapters, you have these little sections about things that would seem kind of almost like unrelated, like tectonics, plate shifting. And I read part of this when I was on my way back from Maui. And I got to the section about the history of the Hawaiian Islands. And
oh, wow.
So what were those sections, and what was your decision to put them into the book?
Yeah, I mean, I am fascinated by places that we live and how they impact us. And I always felt like I've never felt at home, really. Like, where's my home? Because I've moved so much, and you can see that in the book. Like, I lived in a lot of states.
Yeah.
But there's just something about the places we live that become part of our identity. And as I was writing, I wanted to write about those places. And then I started exploring the geology of the places, like the Colorado Rockies and how they form. And that became like this idea of maybe I can use the evolution of the earth as this metaphor for what I'm experiencing in my life. And so I studied a lot of creative nonfiction writing, which uses braided essays where you're doing research and you're using your narrative, but also trying to open up to a bigger world. And so that's what I was trying to do is, the cosmos of how the earth moves.
Right.
It's like the big picture, and then you come back down to the small picture, my little experience, which is just, I'm just one little person in this universe. And I liked the contrast of that. And also it helped keep me grounded when I was writing, Thinking about how big the universe makes me feel safe, which is kind of ironic, but yeah, that's how it works for me.
Which is fascinating because like my creepy crawly topic is space and how big the universe is. Now I'm one little person. My kids were watching a cartoon and they were showing all the planets and then like Earth. And I was like, please turn that off. I'm freaked out. It freaks me out so bad. So it's funny to hear you say that makes you feel safe. But I liked how it was this sort of like time marker among your different clusters of experiences, I guess, which really seemed to be marked by where you lived and the major events. And I don't think it's something that you would expect people to throw in, but I love it as a device.
Oh, good.
Reminding us of our like size in comparison.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that works in your, sending the book off into the world and letting it do something. Maybe someone else will see that like your story is surmountable because there's all these bigger things that manage to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it's not to belittle us or to say like we don't are important. It's more of the say, actually, every story is important. Like your story really is more important than you might think, even if you never write about it. I kind of want readers to walk away with that feeling of your story does matter.
Yeah, definitely. There was one little passage at the end because you sort of tell your whole story through your marriage and then you go back and talk about some snippets of your memories and lessons that you learned or like recollections. And there's this one passage where you talk about your mother talking about how your ancestors were on the Mayflower and you were sort of embarrassed by that. And I was just curious what the reason behind that was. As former military and guys in the Navy who could like track their lineage back to the Pilgrims were like so proud of this fact. And I would think that people in a strong Christian, here at home sort of movement would be proud of that. But I was wondering if you knew like why there was that feeling of like shame.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if shame is the right word. It's more of like recognition of the reality of what really happened when the Pilgrims came. It's kind of also like trying to mirror an earlier story in the book where I did go to Christian school for a couple months, and at Thanksgiving they dressed me up as an Indian girl. And, like looking back, like that wouldn't happen today.
No.
But it's just this grappling I'm doing with heritage and whiteness because Christian patriarchy is also very white supremacist.
Yes.
And so when I went to college and started studying and like reading primary sources of what was happening during colonization of the Americas, I was shocked because I had never been taught anything like that. And so I had this bigger understanding of like what happened when the Mayflower came. And that's my family. My heritage is part of oppression. Like I was oppressed. My ancestors oppressed people. And so it's this bigger, it's trying to open it up to say there's generational trauma here and my ancestors caused trauma.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting parallel. If it makes you feel any better, in public school growing up, they also didn't teach you anything bad about the Mayflower either.
Okay.
They were like Mayflower and Thanksgiving. And, there was a cute cartoon we watched every year where like, what was the representative indigenous person? Squanto, I guess his name was, came.
Yeah, right.
And we invited them for dinner. And when I was in college, I had a professor that had written books on early American history. And he was like, I was in college, I was 18 when I had this professor deliver this lecture where he was like, oh yeah, and we purposely killed people and spread disease and we colonized and this is what it means to be a colonizer. And I was blown away. So like,
yeah.
I don't think you were limited to compared to what they teach in American schools. I feel like we hear about Christian patriarchy and Christian nationalism tie into this whole like white nationalism. We want to remember our history as this amazing thing. And I feel like a lot of these movements seem to write their own sort of like history and rules to an extent.
Yeah.
So I want to check in. I have one more question for you that's sort of just like a fun one, but I wanted to check in and see if there's anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't talk about or things you wanted to mention.
Nothing comes to mind. I feel like we've covered a lot of things. Just that I hope when people come to the book, it's understanding that I'm just telling my story and I'm not trying to tell someone how to live, but just maybe we could learn some things together.
Right.
Through this experience.
So I'm just curious because, I always love movies and I root for the main character the whole way. And then the epilogue is always really disappointing, like a one tile on a screen. So like, how are you doing now? You're on this incredible writing journey. Is this crazy, exciting, fun? Has it been wild? Like, how are things going for Cait today?
That's a good question. Thank you. I think the writing of the book was the hardest part because it's such a solitary work. And, I was reliving these memories by myself and I had to learn how to build a support network at the same time so that I could actually handle doing it. So that was the hardest part. And now it feels like the book is done and it's going out in the world. And I feel like people are receiving it really well so far, which is amazing. Every writer's dream to have people who like your writing.
Yeah.
So I feel really happy. I'm a little overwhelmed because there's a lot going on, but I really hope we can open this conversation up more because I think there's a lot of people who are going through similar things, maybe not this specific movement, but similar things with fundamentalism or patriarchal forces, So I hope that helps. And I want to start writing again, something different, and get back into creativity once it slows down a little bit.
Yeah. Do you have any fun areas that you like to write, like any genres that are not memoirs that you're interested in?
Yeah, I want to go back to fiction a little bit, which is what I started studying in college. I'm really interested in nature writing, but specifically like climate fiction. So still hard topics, but I think I want to figure out what questions I have about the world. And I don't think fiction ever gives us direct answers. And that's why I'm drawn to writing a story, maybe fictionally, about the climate and see what happens.
Yeah, that is a tough area to tackle. A lot of research goes into that, I'm sure. I was also a fiction writer, and everything I do has always turned into a horror story. So I'm in like the horror fiction camp.
I'd love it.
It's just always been my thing. I tried writing a really nice story one time, and it turned into like body parts and reanimated zombies.
Yeah. Awesome.
I tried my hardest, and it just isn't going to happen.
Nice.
I think words when you're writing, and I'm not sure if you experienced this in this book, can be really surprising. Like sometimes they just come and your words do a thing you didn't expect them to do.
Right.
Which is the part I love about writing, is they sort of have their own life.
Like magic.
Oh, and they do what they want to do.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, because we're a true crime podcast, the thing that I read that was like, okay, I'm really excited to do this interview with her personally was, and when we were going to record with Ash, I was like, ooh, I want to ask this question, was you mentioned that you used to sit with your mom and watch Dateline while your mom fell asleep, which I used to sit with my mom and watch Unsolved Mysteries while my mom fell asleep, because she's a couch sleeper. Like as soon as she sits down, she's out.
Yep, same.
And it's like a gene in my family. And you said that you're still really interested and like sort of fascinated by true crime. Was it that experience with her that got you interested in true crime, or is there something about true crime that makes you more interested in it?
I think earlier when I was younger, I was like terrified. It was like, why are we watching this? This is terrible, and I don't want to think about it. And now it's like completely shifted for me. And so I don't know if it's because I had that model or something different, but for me, like watching documentaries about cults or true crime, it helps me process and like feel all my feelings in a timed way. Like it has a specific time to watch this documentary, and it validates my experience a little bit. I feel a little bit more seen. And also I feel like, I don't know, I feel like it prepares me more for anything future to happen. I know that sounds crazy, but...
And I'm assuming you don't mean like, I know what to do if I'm in a dark alley and somebody says, hey, will you help me put this furniture in my truck? You mean like, the answer to that is don't.
Yeah, right.
But like, I'm assuming you mean like with your own experience. And
Yeah, like understanding the spectrum of human behavior, especially when you've seen the dark side of how humans can treat each other. I don't know if you can ever get away from that and move back to a innocent perspective on life. I don't know. I'm just drawn to it in that way and fascinated by how people survive and get out too. Like I really like stories where there's justice or the person got away.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned earlier, you said something I thought was great, which was that there isn't really a normal. There is really no complete normal. Like everybody has a different experience. I totally agree with you, because I think normal is also one of those things that's on a spectrum. Like everybody's spectrum is colored a little differently when it comes to normal. And some people's normal is somewhere on the dark side, right? And and then some people, their normal is what's normal, I think, for them, which is something I know for me, I really value and respect. So I thought that was a great point that you made.
Yeah. I like the word healthy, like I think that's a more descriptive term instead of normal, because normal just says there's like a baseline. But I think I'm aiming for more being healthy than being normal. I'm okay with being weird now because I can't escape my homeschool past. So I'm always going to be a little awkward, but I want to be healthy.
Well, you came to the right podcast, because we are totally the weird girls here. I speak for both of us, but right now I'm speaking for myself. I learned a long time ago that I was weird, and I'm just now sort of embracing it. So I always love when I hear people say like, it's cool, like we should all embrace our inner weird, because
why not? Yeah.
My weird is normal to me, but weird to someone else. But it's my life I have to live, so.
Yeah.
Well, it was amazing to get a chance to talk to you. I've been excited about this. For y'all who are listening, we tried to do this a few weeks ago. We had some audio issues, and I've been just on the edge of my seat waiting to do this interview. Cait's book is, again, called Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. And by the time this comes out, it's available, right?
Should be, yeah.
Do you have a website that they can get it on, or is it on Amazon? Or
Yeah, you can get the book anywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, your local bookstore. You can even request it at your library, so you don't have to spend any money in the library. You can put the money towards it if you want. It's in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. I read the audiobook, which was really empowering to do.
Wow. Oh, you did? I was going to ask. I'm a huge audiobook person.
Yeah. So it's out on audio, and you can find me at cait-west.com. I also have a Substack, and I'm on most social media. Well, I don't know if most is the right word anymore since there's so many now, but I'm on a lot of social media at Cait West Writes. I'd love to hear from people.
Yeah, well, we're so excited we got a chance to connect with you. You can find her book in any of those places, but you cannot have my copy because now it's been marked and it's been dog-eared because that's what I do to my books. So this is mine. But seriously, check out the book. It's really incredible. It's so moving. We're so happy we got to talk to you today. And we are just really grateful for your time and recording with us.
Thank you so much. It's been really, really nice. I'm glad we could finally make it work.
Me too. Me too. Well, until next time, normally what we say at the end, that was real as fuck and real fucked up. But this was not fucked up. This was an incredible time we got to spend with you. And we're really, again, we're just so grateful for you. So thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bum 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 bum. That's fucked up. So fucked up. Can't you see? It's just really fucked. That's fucked up.